Continuing in my series about pregnancy, or specifically questions that often come up when I teach about pregnancy, and I don't always have enough time to answer the questions in a satisfactory manner when I'm in class. And so I can have these videos where I can say, I've got a great video about that. Hopefully it'll give you the information that you need. So what do I want to talk about in this video? I want to talk about conception. When we use the term conception, when we're talking about pregnancy, reproduction, what are we talking about? What does conception mean? So conception, or more specifically in class, I'm usually talking about the event of fertilization. So conception is when the pregnancy officially biologically begins. Fertilization specifically is the event where one sex cell meets another sex cell. What do we mean by sex cells? I don't know what you've had in other classes, but you might be familiar with the term gamete. A gamete is what the fancy term for the sex cells that have chromosomes. Specifically, they have half the chromosomes that you would have in a typical human body cell. You have 46 chromosomes, typically. Not everybody does, but typically you have 46 chromosomes in a gamete or a sex cell, like an ovum, which many people would call an egg, or sperm. They have typically 23 chromosomes. Those two sets of chromosomes, those 23 plus 23, can come together to create this new individual, this new individual with 46 chromosomes. Okay, so that's some textbook stuff that students might have to learn when they're learning about prenatal development. Okay, where'd they come from? Where did those sex cells come from? All right, so if fertilization is happening inside the body, if you want to get fancy, what we can call an in vivo fertilization, in vivo inside the body, which can happen from what my doctor used to euphemistically refer to as having relations. It could also happen from certain procedures like intrauterine insemination. But let's use what most people are familiar with. Let's talk about the type where you have relations and it leads to a pregnancy, it leads to a conception, it leads to fertilization. All right, so how did those two get to meet? And I know a lot of times when I teach about this in class, a lot of students, they might giggle and they'll be like, okay, duh, we know what's going on here, but I do like to back things up and make sure, we understand the steps in the process. Let's start with the ovum, all right? Let's start with, one half of the gametes that have to come together for fertilization. All right, and first of all, I do want to point out, in case you're not aware, the typical situation is to have one ovum and one sperm involved in fertilization. If two sperm penetrate, fertilize the same ovum, that's not a good situation. And I could do the whole separate video about how this can lead to a very risky situation. And that's not the typical situation, but you don't want that to happen. Sometimes I'll have students who mistakenly think that that's how we get twins. And actually, twins can happen multiple ways, but they don't involve two sperm fertilizing one ovum. So you got one sperm, one ovum. Where'd the ovum come from? All right. And I think many of you may be familiar, but let's just make sure we do go through the basics. That ovum is sitting around waiting to be fertilized because ovulation has happened. All right. So what is ovulation? I do often have students say, oh, I know. And I'll say, well, what is it? Let's do a little pretest. Let's answer some questions. And then sometimes they come back and they're like, actually, I don't know. I just know it's a thing that's important, but I'm not sure I actually know what it is. So let's talk a little bit about ovulation. Right, so ovulation. In someone who has ovaries, and I am using the term someone who has ovaries instead of like woman or female, because not everybody who falls under the category of woman or female has ovaries. I mean, just at the very simplest explanation is sometimes you have to have them removed because of cancer and things like that. I don't have a uterus. I had to have mine removed for medical reasons. So I'm really big on, using the appropriate level of specificity when we talk about stuff like that. All right, so for someone who has ovaries and they are past the age of puberty, and so they are ovulating, how do you know that they're capable of ovulation? Your best hint is they've started menstruating. They've started having menstrual periods. All right, so someone who is capable of ovulation. At some point during a menstrual cycle, what is a menstrual cycle? I know plenty of people will use that term as sort of synonymous with menstrual period. It is not, or at least, medically, biologically, it is not. So a menstrual cycle is the time span from the beginning of one menstrual period to the beginning of another menstrual period. That is the menstrual cycle. All right. During that cycle, ovulation happens. Ovulation, the event, is when one of the ovaries will release an ovum. What do we mean by release an ovum? Because a lot of times students are like, well, I'm kind of not sure. What does that mean? Sometimes if I say, well, what would it look like? And they might describe something like from like old Mario video games where you have this sort of round thing just releasing something, like spitting it out. All right. So, and this is very basic. I could go into way more detail. I'm trying to keep it kind of basic. But with ovulation, both ovaries, all right, because you have right and, well, not everybody has a right and left ovary, but most people with ovaries have a right and left ovary. And so both ovaries, they will swell, right? They will swell during the menstrual cycle. During the first part of the menstrual cycle, they will swell. And these things called follicles will get larger. They will swell. They get bumpy. You get bumpy ovaries. And at a certain point during the menstrual cycle, there is a surge of a particular hormone. If you're curious, it's called luteinizing hormone. This surge in luteinizing hormone, it basically sends a signal, hey, whichever one is biggest, and I'm doing the simplified version, but whichever one is biggest, release that one. All right, so the biggest, most swollen follicle wins. It gets released as the ovum. Is it possible to release more than one? Yes, it is. That is one of the most common ways that someone can have twins, for example. It's not the typical default setting, but it can certainly happen. All right, we're going to assume just one. All right, so one ovum has been released. Where does it go? Where is it in the body? All right, and so the ovaries are not, the ovaries are not attached to the uterus and the fallopian tubes. Now, if you don't remember what any of, like what are fallopian tubes, what are uterus, hopefully my not so tech savvy self will remember to put a little image here so you can kind of see your schematic, or you can probably Google it too. But when people think of the female reproductive system, sometimes they either fix the image in their head, or they might have seen an image that sort of drew it or depicted it wrong, where they show the ovaries as if they're actually directly connected, and they're not. They're kind of floating out there, and they have these like cilia, these extensions that will, once the ovum is released, they will help them get into the fallopian tubes, and that we want them to get there. We don't want them to be released outside the body, outside the uterus, outside that female reproductive system. All right, so floating around, they get into the fallopian tubes, and there's traveling. They can that ovum can travel further down. All right, but typically you're going to have an ovum kind of sitting in the fallopian tubes, waiting for possible fertilization. All right, so what's the timeline here? How long can that ovum wait around for fertilization? And sometimes I'll open it up to students and I'll say, hey, who's got a guess? Who wants to say? And I'll get all sorts of guesses. And 12 to 24 hours. And I'll see different numbers in different textbooks, but that's typically what I see. And I did just go and check and make sure it didn't, that the stats didn't get updated, because sometimes that does happen to me. Medical science advances sometimes. All right, so we're dealing with about 24 hours. All right, so maybe you got 24 hours where that ovum's hanging around, possibly could be fertilized. So sometimes if students don't hear the rest of the picture, sometimes they'll hear that and they'll think, oh, okay, so there's really like a short window of time where conception could happen. And I have met grown, educated adults who genuinely did believe this. They thought, okay, so if you time relations, unprotected or poorly protected relations, if they were timed just so, you could probably avoid conception if you were trying to avoid it. Or like if you were trying to make it happen, it'd be really difficult because you're trying to make it happen at that exact time when that ovum would be released or very close to that. Okay, so the ovum's kind of half of the picture here. We have to talk about those sperm too. Now, before we talk about the sperm though, even with the ovum, things are not always simple and clear-cut as people think that they are. Because if I'll say, okay, so that ovum hanging around waiting to possibly be fertilized, when might that happen? When does ovulation happen? And I will get some really wrong answers from students. I've had some students say, well, ovulation happens when the woman's having her period. And I'm like, no, that's actually, that's wrong. Now, could a conception result from relations when someone's still having their period? Yes, it could. Hopefully I'll remember to explain why later. But that actually is possible. Not particularly likely, but possible. But that's not because that's when ovulation is happening. Ovulation happens typically it's happening between periods, unless someone has a really long period. And remember how I said that the menstrual cycle goes from the beginning of one period to the beginning of the next period. The beginning of the period is meaningful for timing things. The end isn't, because people have individual differences. The length of time that someone is shedding the uterine lining and actually bleeding, people have individual differences. Some people it's just a couple of days, some people it's many days, even weeks. And so the end is not as meaningful as the beginning. So let's point that out. Now, the other thing is, well, how far into the menstrual cycle does ovulation happen? Many people will say, oh, I know, 14 days, all right? Because they've heard that a menstrual cycle is 28 days. So ovulation happens on day 14. Those are just averages. There is nothing guaranteed about those numbers. First of all, the 28-day cycle, that's an average. That's what you see in a textbook. Many people have shorter or longer cycles. Sometimes they regularly have longer cycles. Other times they just one cycle will be particularly long or particularly short. So even if someone has pretty typical length in their cycles, there's no guarantee that one individual cycle will be of their usual length. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is that day 14, it's like in the middle of that 28-day cycle. So sometimes people mistakenly think, well, oh, it happens in the middle. There's nothing middle about it necessarily. It just kind of works out that way in a nice textbook cycle. Things have to happen before ovulation can happen, and it usually works out that that's going to happen on average. Notice I'm doing a lot of on average because that's the best we have to go by. On average, about 14 days before the next menstrual cycle, when a pregnancy doesn't happen. 14 days before the next menstrual cycle is where we can see that ovulation happening. You say, well, wait, that's not going to help us try to prevent or try to make pregnancy happen. If we're trying to do family planning sort of stuff, we're not going to be able to do that with this information. We don't know when the next one's coming. All right, that's the issue. You typically don't know. There are things you can do to try to get an idea of when ovulation is coming. One thing is some people will check certain bodily signs and signals, like you can check your basal body temperature. You can use a special thermometer that's more precise than your typical thermometer. And you look for a tiny little minute spike in temperature that will happen before ovulation. And it's not a guaranteed thing. It kind of gives you hints. You can also check for cervical mucus, which some people are comfortable checking. It changes in consistency near the time of ovulation. And then there are kits you can buy now, kits and tests that you can buy where they kind of work like a pregnancy test, where you urinate on them and they detect that luteinizing hormone that I mentioned earlier. And they don't tell you exactly when ovulation happens, but they tell you when ovulation is likely to happen in the next day. It might have been 24 to 48 hours, if I remember correctly, but it basically gives you a time window, hey, it's likely to happen soon. So if you want to take advantage, you could take advantage, if you were trying to conceive. All right, so when does ovulation happen? The best you can do is say, well, we can estimate when it's likely to happen, but it doesn't happen on this guaranteed day. So it is problematic when I'll hear people say things like, oh, well, if you don't want a pregnancy, just, make sure you don't have any relation. I mean, they obviously are not going to use the term relations, but yeah. Yes, they just don't have relations on day 14 of your cycle. And I'm like, well, no, it's not quite that simple. All right, so let's talk about sperm. It's time. All right, so the sperm, how did the sperm get there? And I don't mean in the way that people like to start giggling like, ha ha ha, we know people did something and that's how the sperm is in there. All right, maybe there was no protection, maybe there was an inadequate attempt at protection, at prevention, but the sperm is in this body. It has to travel. Those are some of the issues with trying to figure out timing and whatnot. So the sperm has to travel up through the uterus and into one of the fallopian tubes. Now, when sperm is released, they could go either way. They can go into left or right fallopian tube. Some sperm are not going to get to win, the game of fertilization because they don't go into the correct fallopian tube, or it could be that, there's no ovum because it's not the time of ovulation, or perhaps the person is suppressing ovulation, or maybe they're one of the ones who don't have ovaries. But in the situation where they get the chance to meet, you've got a lot of sperm that have swum up the fallopian tube, the one where that ovum is sitting, and they get the chance to be the winner, to be the one that fertilizes that ovum. All right, timing of sperm. Well, first of all, with sperm production, it's different than ovulation. Ovulation happens once per cycle. Sperm production can happen on a pretty regular basis. It doesn't happen on a cyclical pattern. All right, and how long can sperm last? Now, some sperm will die just from not making it that far, from from swimming around, hitting the walls of the uterus and things like that. But the thing is, when sperm are released, it's a lot of sperm, like millions typically. So it's a lot of sperm. You get a lot of leftovers that can make it as far as that fallopian tube. And how long can they last? Because here is really the tricky issue when we're figuring out the timing of conception, is sometimes the sperm got there before the ovum. I think a lot of people in their mind, they think, okay, so the ovum and the sperm, they get there at the same time. Well, there can be, you can have a mismatch. You can have an ovum get there and be like, what's going on here? Oh, look, and there's some sperm swimming up to greet me. Other times the sperm are like, great, ovum, you've joined the party. We've been waiting for you. So how long could sperm have been waiting there, ready for possible fertilization once that ovum gets into the fallopian tubes? The numbers have changed since I first started teaching. It's gotten longer. All right. I used to always see estimates of 3 to 4 days. Now I'm starting to see up to 6 days in some resources, some textbooks that I use for teaching. So possibly as long as 6 days. Definitely 3 to 4 days is a reasonable estimate of how long sperm could stick around. So that means if you're thinking about, when would sexual relations have to happen for conception to happen? It could be 3 to 4 days before ovulation. It could also be 1 day after ovulation, because you got that 24-hour window. So you've got a good span of time, a good stretch of time. You might have a week or almost a week in there where conception, fertilization is possible. So people who are, trying to use timing to their advantage, you have to allow for this wide window for when conception could occur. I almost forgot to say how someone could have a conception resulting from relations during a period. If someone has a period that lasts for a long time and they ovulate on the earlier side, because some people will ovulate as early as day 10 in their cycle, and you can have periods that last as late as late as that, or even on the average normal side, you can have like day 7 bleeding still going on. And so someone having relations during that time, the sperm could stick around. You could have that early ovulation. So it is not necessarily typical or likely, but it is possible to have a fertilization result from relations that happen during the actual period. So that's how it can happen. Just to tie in with some other videos that I've made previously. So if fertilization happens a pregnancy has begun. You now have a single-celled organism called a zygote. Now, if you were going to a doctor to figure out your due date, once you know that that pregnancy is there, they're going to add on extra time to your pregnancy before conception. I've talked about that in a previous video, because a lot of people don't know the exact time of ovulation or conception. So they start the pregnancy on the first day of the last menstrual period. So just one of the many things that can confuse people about pregnancy. Hopefully I've cleared up any questions that you might have had about this particular topic. Anything you'd like me to talk about, please tell me in the comments. I can definitely make future videos based on your questions and your comments. Thanks for watching.